My mom, Brenda, with her perpetually coiffed blonde hair and an air of detached amusement, would often say, "Isabella, you're just so mature for your age. It's a gift." My dad, Richard, equally polished and seemingly preoccupied with his new business venture, a vague, perpetually struggling online concept, would nod sagely, usually while scrolling through his phone. This wasn't a compliment. It was a carefully constructed cage, a gilded prison where I, Isabella, or Izzy, as my siblings called me, was the sole warden of 5 younger souls. It started subtly. When Liam, my first younger brother, was 4 and I was 10, Mom began disappearing for spa days or business networking luncheons. Dad was always working late in his home office, the door often locked. Liam would wander into my room, whimpering for a snack, and I'd find myself making him toast. Then Chloe and Noah, the whirlwind twins, arrived, swiftly followed by Sophie, and finally Daniel, a baby who never quite stopped needing the ceaseless attention my parents were increasingly unwilling to provide. By the time I was 14, Daniel was 2, a chubby-cheeked toddler, and I was the primary caregiver for a household of 5 children, plus myself. Our house in suburban upstate New York looked idyllic from the outside. A 2-story colonial with a neatly manicured lawn, a swing set in the backyard, and a welcome wreath on the front door. Inside, however, was a different story. The pristine living room and dining area, reserved for my parents as occasional guests, stood in stark contrast to the rest of the house. The kitchen, perpetually in a state of post-meal chaos, was my domain. The laundry room was a mountain of clothes I perpetually conquered. And my bedroom was Grand Central Station. My parents, particularly Mom, had a talent for making their neglect sound like my privilege. "You have such a bond with them, Izzy." She'd coo, watching me change Daniel's diaper while she scrolled through social media. "It's truly special how they look up to you." They praised my responsibility while handing me new tasks. Midnight feedings for Daniel? Izzy sleeps lighter than us anyway. Potty training Chloe and Noah? "You're so good with routines, darling." Homework help for Liam and Sophie? They just respond better to you. Doctor visits, school pickups, making dinner, managing bath time. It all fell to me. My own schoolwork became a secondary concern, crammed into the late hours after everyone else was asleep, or more often, neglected entirely. "Don't you ever dare complain," Mom had hissed at me once, her perfect smile dropping like a stone. Daniel was barely 6 months old then, gurgling in my arms. Social services would split you all up, send them to different homes, terrible places. Is that what you want? The image, fueled by her dramatic warnings, had terrified me. My heart ached at the thought of losing them. Liam, with his earnest questions and wide, trusting eyes. The twins, Chloe and Noah, inseparable and always inventing secret games. Sophie, a bubbly sprite who drew me endless pictures of stick figures labeled Mama Izzy. And little Daniel, whose tiny fingers would grip mine so tightly, as if I were his entire world. I was their anchor, their safety net, and they, in turn, were my purpose, my reason for enduring. My parents' social life flourished as mine withered. While I was attempting to teach Liam long division and explain why the twins couldn't eat mud, Richard and Brenda were at golf courses, cocktail parties, or retreats for Richard's business. They'd leave a vague note, a dwindling stack of $20 bills, and a laundry list of instructions. "Make sure Daniel gets his vitamins. Liam has a soccer game you'll need to drive. Chloe and Noah need new shoes. Sophie's science project is due." There was never any question of how I was to accomplish all this, only the expectation that it would be done. One chilly autumn evening, Liam, then 10, came to me, clutching his stomach, his face pale and clammy. He'd been complaining of a stomachache all day, but when I'd mentioned it to Mom earlier, she'd waved a dismissive hand. "He's just trying to get out of homework, Izzy. Don't coddle him." But this was different. He was sweating, his eyes wide with pain. I checked his temperature, 102.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Panic seized me. I pounded on my parents' locked office door. No answer. I called their cell phones. Both went straight to voicemail. I remembered Mrs. Henderson, our next-door neighbor, a kind, elderly woman who often slipped me cookies. Desperate, I bundled Liam in a blanket, woke Chloe and Noah to explain, and left Sophie and Daniel sleeping. I practically dragged Liam to Mrs. Henderson's door. She took one look at his ashen face, felt his forehead, and her own face changed. Within minutes, she had us in her old sedan, rushing to the nearest urgent care clinic. At the clinic, the doctor, a young woman with a calm demeanor, quickly assessed Liam. "His appendix is inflamed," she said, her voice grave. "He needs to go to the emergency room immediately for surgery. This is serious." My blood ran cold. I tried to call my parents again. Still no answer. The doctor kept looking at me, then at Liam, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Where are your parents, dear?" she asked gently. I mumbled something about them being out of town for business, trying to sound believable, trying to mimic Mom's casual confidence. But my voice trembled. Liam was whisked away for tests. Mrs. Henderson stayed by my side, her hand a warm anchor on my arm. When the hospital staff realized Liam was a minor and his parents were unreachable, a social worker was called. Miss Anya Sharma arrived, her expression professional but kind. She asked me routine questions. Who lived at home? Who was usually responsible for the children when my parents were expected back? I repeated the practiced lies, fear a cold knot in my stomach. The threat of separation, of losing my siblings, loomed larger than Liam's immediate crisis. "He needs a parent's consent for surgery, Izzy," Miss Sharma said, her gaze steady. "We can't wait." Tears stung my eyes. I pulled out my phone again, trying every number I could think of. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mom's voice, groggy and annoyed, answered. "What is it, Izzy? Do you know what time it is?" It was 2 a.m. I choked out Liam's condition, the hospital, the urgent need for consent. There was a long silence, then a sigh. "Fine, just put them on the phone. And for goodness sake, try not to be so dramatic." She hung up before I could explain anything else. Richard and Brenda arrived 2 hours later, looking rumpled but quickly regaining their composure. They breezed past me, barely acknowledging my presence, and headed straight for the nurse's station, all practiced concern. "Our poor Liam," Brenda sighed to a sympathetic nurse. "He's always been so delicate. We're just devastated we were out of town." Richard added, "Our daughter Izzy is so mature. She handles everything when we're away. We trust her implicitly." They made it sound like I was an incredibly capable, albeit slightly overzealous, babysitter. Miss Sharma observed them, her gaze lingering on my parents' superficiality. She saw them sign the consent forms, ask minimal questions about the procedure, and then retreat to the waiting room, immediately pulling out their phones. She saw how Liam, groggy from pre-op medication, reached for my hand, not theirs, when the nurse came to take him away. She saw me wipe away a tear as they wheeled him into surgery, while my parents continued to scroll. Over the next few days, while Liam recovered, Miss Sharma kept returning. She spoke to Liam, who in his innocent way described how Mama Izzy always made his favorite chicken soup when he was sick. Chloe and Noah, visiting with Mrs. Henderson, chattered about how Izzy always braids our hair for school, and Izzy reads us stories at bedtime because Mommy and Daddy are too busy. Sophie, clutching a crayon drawing of me surrounded by stick figures, proudly declared, "Izzy is my best friend. She fixes everything." Even Daniel, barely speaking, would babble, "Izzy, Izzy," whenever he saw me. My parents, meanwhile, fluttered in and out, bringing expensive toys and asking superficial questions, always checking their watches. The more Miss Sharma observed, the more her initial professional curiosity turned to something else. Her eyes, which had initially held a neutral, assessing gaze, now held a hint of concern, then a growing certainty. She requested a home visit. My parents, usually so adept at charming strangers, hesitated. "Oh, our home is undergoing some renovations," Brenda began, fanning herself with a magazine. "It's not quite ready for guests." But Miss Sharma was firm. "It's standard procedure, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds. I need to assess the children's living environment." They had no choice but to agree. The home visit was a nightmare I had anticipated for years. I had tried to prepare, frantically cleaning and tidying, but you can't hide years of neglect in an hour. Miss Sharma, accompanied by another social worker, arrived with Mrs. Henderson, who had become our steadfast ally. My parents put on their best performance. Brenda, in a designer apron, offered freshly baked cookies, clearly store-bought. Richard, looking authoritative, explained their unique parenting philosophy that encouraged independence and sibling bonding. They showed off the guest rooms, pristine and untouched, claiming they were the children's rooms. "Liam's a budding astrophysicist," Brenda chirped, opening a door to a sterile room with a single telescope propped in the corner. "And the girls love their pink princess room," she gestured to another empty room. But when Miss Sharma asked to see my room, our room, a subtle shift occurred. Brenda's smile faltered. Richard cleared his throat. They led the way to my bedroom, a small space crammed with makeshift solutions, a twin bed against one wall, a crib for Daniel in the corner, and a collection of sleeping bags neatly rolled up in the closet. A single dresser overflowed with clothes for 7 people of varying sizes. The worn-out calendar on the wall, meticulously tracking school events, doctor appointments, and meal plans, stood as silent testimony. And then there was the lock. On the outside of the door, Miss Sharma's eyes narrowed. She tested it, noting how it only worked from the outside. "Why is there a lock on the outside of your daughter's bedroom door, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Richard mumbled something about safety and keeping the younger ones from wandering at night. But then, Noah, ever the literalist, piped up, "It keeps us in when Mom and Dad have parties. Izzy says it's a game, hiding from dragons." Chloe nodded in agreement, adding, "Yeah, and we have to be super quiet or the dragons get mad." The truth, raw and unvarnished, spilled out in innocent bursts. Liam explained how Izzy helped him with his homework every night. Sophie brought a stack of her drawings, all featuring Mama Izzy and the siblings, but conspicuously devoid of our actual parents. Daniel, pointing to the crib, babbled, "Izzy sleep here too." Miss Sharma took pictures. She made copious notes. She asked careful, pointed questions that my siblings answered with a heartbreaking honesty. My parents tried to interject, to explain away the evidence, but their words sounded increasingly hollow, their voices shrill with desperation. Brenda tried a last-ditch manipulation, pulling Miss Sharma aside and whispering about my delusions and unhealthy attachment. But Mrs. Henderson had been watching, observing with growing horror. She finally spoke up, her voice shaking with controlled fury. She asked my parents when they had last fed their children, when they had helped with homework, or kissed a scraped knee, or read a bedtime story. She asked them to name their children's teachers, their favorite foods, their fears. Silence. The silence hung heavy in the room, thick with guilt and shame. Richard tried to deflect, but Mrs. Henderson wasn't done. She asked why a 14-year-old had permission slips for 6 children in her backpack. Why she knew the pediatrician's number by heart. Why the only recent family photos were selfies I had taken with my siblings, no parents in sight. Brenda's mask finally shattered completely. We gave her everything, she shrieked, her voice cracking. A roof over her head, food to eat, siblings to love. What more did she want? Love, I thought, the word a bitter taste in my mouth. Parents, a childhood, the chance to be a sister instead of a mother. But the words remained locked in my throat, just as they had been for years. Miss Sharma had seen enough. She announced that she needed to make some calls, consult with her supervisor. In the meantime, she strongly recommended the children return to Mrs. Henderson's house for the night. Brenda protested vehemently, but it wasn't a request. Miss Sharma's tone made that clear. She would be in touch tomorrow with next steps. There would be a formal investigation, home visits, interviews, court involvement if necessary. The word court made my stomach drop, but Mrs. Henderson's hand found mine again, steady and sure. She'd seen the truth now. She understood what they'd done to me, to us. We gathered what we could carry. Favorite stuffed animals, Daniel's special blanket, the twins' shared pillow. My parents watched from the doorway, their perfect parent performance finally over. As we loaded back into Mrs. Henderson's van, Brenda caught my arm. Her nails dug in just enough to hurt. She leaned close, her breath hot against my ear. You'll regret this, Izzy. You're lucky we didn't just give them away. Foster care splits families, Izzy. They'll never see each other again, and it will be all your fault for not being grateful. But Mrs. Henderson stepped between us, breaking Brenda's grip. She told my mother that the only fault here was theirs, that what they had done had a name, and that name was abuse. We drove away in silence. My siblings dozed around me, exhausted from the emotional upheaval. I stared out the window at passing streetlights, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The streetlights blurred past as Mrs. Henderson navigated through familiar neighborhoods. I held Daniel tighter, his small body radiating warmth against my chest. The twins had fallen asleep, holding hands across my lap, and Liam's head rested heavy on my shoulder. Only Sophie remained awake, her eyes wide with confusion. Mrs. Henderson's house appeared like a sanctuary in the darkness. We stumbled inside, exhausted children, clinging to whatever part of me they could reach. I settled them in the guest rooms, maintaining our usual sleeping arrangement, because anything else would have terrified them. Daniel whimpered when I tried to put him down, his fingers tangled in my shirt, seeking the familiar comfort. The house phone rang just as I'd gotten everyone settled. Mrs. Henderson answered in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Brenda's shrill tone penetrated even from a distance, making accusations and demands. Mrs. Henderson hung up mid-sentence. She appeared in the doorway, her face grim. She explained that my parents were already working on their next move. They'd called their lawyer friend, someone who owed Richard a favor from years back. The manipulation machine was already spinning. I tucked blankets around my siblings, my hands moving automatically through routines I'd perfected over years. Mrs. Henderson watched from the doorway, her expression shifting between anger and sorrow. She whispered that she should have known, should have visited more often, should have seen through the facade. I shook my head. My parents had been too good at their performance. Morning arrived too quickly. Miss Sharma called early, scheduling another meeting for that afternoon. She needed to interview each child separately, she explained. Standard procedure for cases involving multiple minors. My stomach churned at the thought of my siblings being questioned alone. Mrs. Henderson made breakfast while I dressed the little ones. She'd gone out early and bought clothes that actually fit them. Something my parents had never bothered with. Sophie twirled in her new dress, delighted by the bright flowers printed across the fabric. Such a simple thing, yet it made my chest tight with emotion. The doorbell rang just as we finished eating. My parents stood on the porch, dressed impeccably. Brenda wore her church outfit, the one that made her look like a devoted mother. Richard had his arm around her shoulders, a picture of practiced solidarity. They brought a woman with them. She introduced herself as their family counselor, someone they'd been seeing to address the situation with Isabella. Another lie, but one impossible to disprove. The counselor spoke softly about family dysfunction and enabling behaviors, using clinical terms that made me sound disturbed. Mrs. Henderson refused to let them inside. The conversation happened on the porch. My siblings pressed against the windows watching. Brenda noticed and waved, her smile bright and false. None of them waved back. The counselor handed Mrs. Henderson a folder. Inside were printed emails, supposedly from teachers, expressing concern about my possessive behavior with my siblings. Forged. I knew immediately. The dates were wrong, the language too formal, but doubt flickered across Mrs. Henderson's face. My parents left with promises to return with their lawyer. The counselor patted my shoulder as she passed, whispering that help was available when I was ready to accept it. Her touch made my skin crawl. Inside, Mrs. Henderson spread the papers across her kitchen table. She studied each one carefully while I tried to keep my siblings occupied. But Liam had heard enough. He crept to my side and pressed a crumpled paper into my hand. His school journal, the one I'd helped him with last month. The entry was about family. He'd drawn our house with stick figures, 5 small ones clustered in a single room with me, and 2 larger ones standing far away. His teacher's comment in red pen, "Liam seems confused about family roles. Please discuss at conference." Mrs. Henderson read it, and her jaw tightened. She asked Liam who had attended his parent-teacher conference. He pointed at me, explaining how I'd had to pretend to be the babysitter because parents were supposed to come, not sisters. She began making calls. Her church friends, other grandmothers who'd raised concerns about never seeing my siblings at school events. Pieces of a puzzle my parents hadn't realized existed. Mrs. Gable from down the street remembered seeing me walking 5 kids to the bus stop every morning while my parents' cars sat in the driveway. Miss Sharma arrived promptly at 2. She'd brought a colleague, someone who specialized in cases involving multiple children. They set up in different rooms, preparing to interview each child separately. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't protect them from questions I couldn't hear. Daniel went first, carried by Miss Sharma's colleague, because he refused to walk away from me. His whimpers echoed through the house for 20 minutes before they gave up and brought him back. He burrowed into my arms, trembling. The twins went together, insisting they couldn't be separated. Through the closed door, I heard Chloe's clear voice explaining their daily routine. How I braided their hair each morning because Mom said it wasn't her job. How I knew which twin liked peanut butter and which preferred jelly. Noah added how I always knew where their favorite stuffed animals were. Liam surprised me. He walked into the room with his shoulders squared, my brave boy trying to protect us all. He emerged 30 minutes later with red eyes, but determination on his face. He whispered that he told them everything about the lock on the door and how I made up the dragon game. He explained how I made sure they all finished their homework and helped them with projects. Sophie brought her drawings. I watched her carry a whole stack into the interview room. When she came out, Miss Sharma's colleague followed, holding one particular picture. It showed a figure labeled Mama Izzy, surrounded by 5 smaller figures, while 2 adult shapes stood outside a thick black border. Sophie had added a speech bubble for me. "I love you all so much." Ivy went last, clutching the doll Mrs. Henderson had given her that morning. She chatted nervously as Miss Sharma led her away. Through the door, her voice carried clearly as she explained how I fixed her always and read her stories and checked for monsters because the other grown-ups were always too busy. While they interviewed my siblings, Miss Sharma questioned me in the kitchen. She asked about daily routines, medical care, educational decisions. I answered honestly, too exhausted to maintain any pretense. She took notes as I explained about forging permission slips and parent signatures, about missing school for pediatrician appointments, about stretching a meager $100 to feed 7 kids for a week. She asked why I'd never told anyone. The question hung heavy between us. How could I explain years of psychological conditioning, the constant threat of separation, the way Mom had made me believe I was the only thing standing between my siblings and disaster? I tried anyway. I told her about the warnings that started when Daniel was born, the stories about foster care that gave me nightmares, the time Mom had driven us past a group home and described in detail how my siblings would suffer there because of my selfishness. Miss Sharma's expression shifted. She asked if I'd ever been allowed to have friends over, if I'd attended school events or activities, if I'd had any life outside caring for my siblings. The answer to everything was no. The interviews concluded as evening approached. Miss Sharma and her colleague conferred quietly while I made dinner with Mrs. Henderson's help. My siblings clung closer than usual, unsettled by the questions and separation. Daniel hadn't let go of me since his interview attempt. Miss Sharma explained their preliminary findings. The children showed clear signs of parentification and role confusion. My siblings genuinely believed I was their primary caregiver. They showed minimal attachment to our parents and significant anxiety when separated from me. She scheduled a formal assessment for the next day. A child psychologist would evaluate our family dynamics. In the meantime, she strongly recommended the children remain in Mrs. Henderson's care. She gave my parents this news over the phone, and I could hear Brenda's explosion from across the room. That night, I barely slept. My siblings piled around me like usual, seeking comfort and familiarity, but my mind raced with possibilities. What if the psychologist agreed with my parents? What if they decided I was the problem? What if splitting us up really was the best solution? The morning brought new challenges. My parents arrived with their lawyer, a man who smiled too much and spoke in careful, measured tones. He presented documents about grandparent rights and custody arrangements, using legal terms designed to confuse and intimidate. But Mrs. Henderson had made calls too. Her friend's daughter was a family law attorney who agreed to advise us pro bono. Sarah Jenkins arrived just as the meeting began, matching the other lawyer's smile with steel in her eyes. The psychologist arrived separately. Dr. Eleanor Vance was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Sophie at ease. She observed our morning routine without interfering, taking notes as I helped Liam tie his shoes and braided the twins' hair. My parents performed beautifully. They greeted each child warmly, though Daniel whimpered when Richard reached for him. Brenda explained it away as a phase, temporary confusion that would resolve once proper boundaries were established. She'd researched attachment disorders extensively overnight. Dr. Vance conducted her evaluation through observation and play. She watched how my siblings naturally oriented toward me, how they sought my approval before answering questions, how they looked to me for comfort when confused or scared. She observed my parents, too, how Brenda's smile never reached her eyes when she looked at the younger children, how Richard checked his phone constantly, more interested in work emails than his children's activities, how neither of them knew which twin was which without checking the small birthmark on Chloe's wrist. The lawyers tried to control the narrative. The lawyer presented Richard and Brenda as victims of a disturbed teenager who inserted herself inappropriately into a parental role. He had printouts from online forums about sibling abuse, highlighting passages about older children who manipulated younger ones. But then Liam did something unexpected. He walked to the table where the adult sat and placed his journal in front of Dr. Vance. He'd written a new entry that morning, asking me to help him spell the words correctly. My sister takes care of us because nobody else does. She isn't mean. She loves us. Please don't take her away. Brenda's mask slipped. She snapped at Liam for lying, for being manipulated, for not understanding the situation. Her voice rose, sharp enough to make Sophie cry. Richard tried to calm her, but the damage was done. Dr. Vance had seen the real woman behind the performance. The evaluation continued for hours. Dr. Vance interviewed Mrs. Henderson about her observations. Mrs. Gable from down the street arrived unexpectedly, having heard about the situation from church friends. She testified about seeing me manage 5 children alone, about my parents' cars in the driveway while I walked everyone to school in the rain. My old English teacher, Miss Rodriguez, came too. She kept records of every forged signature, every missed parent conference where I'd shown up instead. Every time she tried to contact my parents about my absences, only to be told I was going through a phase. The evidence mounted like building blocks. Each person added another piece to the picture of neglect and abandonment my parents had carefully hidden. Brenda grew increasingly agitated, her perfect mother facade cracking with each testimony. She finally exploded when the school counselor arrived with documentation of my declining grades and exhaustion. Brenda accused everyone of conspiring against her, of trying to steal her children, of not understanding how difficult I'd made things. Richard tried damage control, but it was too late. Dr. Vance had seen enough. She announced she needed to make her report to Miss Sharma immediately. The formal recommendation would take time, but her initial assessment was clear. The children had been subjected to severe parentification and emotional neglect. My parents' lawyer tried to argue, but even he seemed to realize the battle was shifting. He advised them to leave before more damage was done. Brenda refused at first, making wild accusations about Mrs. Henderson poisoning the children against her. But when Daniel started crying and reaching for me, when the twins hid behind my legs, when even brave Liam backed away from her approach, she finally stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. They left with threats of court battles and custody fights. The lawyer promised this wasn't over, that parents had rights. That one bad day didn't erase years of providing food and shelter, but his words rang hollow against the evidence of systematic neglect. That evening, Miss Sharma returned with official documents. Emergency custody was being transferred to Mrs. Henderson temporarily. A full investigation would follow, but for now, we could stay together. The relief nearly knocked me off my feet. Mrs. Henderson signed papers while I held my siblings close. They didn't understand the legal complexities, but they knew something important had happened. Sophie asked if we could stay forever. I couldn't answer through the tears. Miss Sharma explained the next steps. There would be court hearings, custody evaluations, mandatory family counseling. My parents would have supervised visitation rights initially. The process would be long and difficult, but the immediate danger had passed. She pulled me aside privately. She acknowledged what I'd done, the impossible situation I'd been forced into. She promised that keeping us together was the priority, that no one would punish me for protecting my siblings the only way I knew how. That night, Mrs. Henderson tucked us all into beds she'd hastily assembled in her guest rooms. Real beds with clean sheets and enough space for everyone. Daniel still insisted on sleeping next to me, but for the first time, it felt like a choice rather than necessity. I lay awake listening to their peaceful breathing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. My parents wouldn't give up easily. There would be court dates and evaluations and questions I didn't want to answer. But tonight, we were safe. We were together. And for the first time in 4 years, I had an adult who truly wanted to help. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, checking on us one more time. She whispered that she'd hired a better lawyer, someone who specialized in cases like ours, someone who understood that family wasn't just about blood, but about who showed up when it mattered. The coming weeks would test us all. My parents would try every manipulation, every legal maneuver, every emotional weapon in their arsenal. But something had fundamentally shifted. The truth was out. The performance was over. And I was no longer alone in protecting the only family that mattered to me. The next morning brought chaos to Mrs. Henderson's doorstep. My parents arrived with 2 lawyers this time, their expressions cold and calculated. Brenda wore a conservative suit that made her look like a grieving mother. Richard carried a thick folder of documents. They filed emergency motions overnight. Their lawyers presented papers claiming I'd kidnapped my siblings. That Mrs. Henderson was enabling a dangerous situation. They demanded immediate return of the children, pending a full investigation. Mrs. Henderson's lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, reviewed the documents while I kept my siblings in the back room. Through the window, I watched Brenda dab at dry eyes for the lawyer's benefit. Richard checked his watch repeatedly, annoyed at the inconvenience. Miss Sharma arrived within the hour, accompanied by her supervisor. They'd received the emergency filing and needed to assess the situation immediately. My stomach churned as they explained that such serious allegations required immediate action. The supervisor, a stern woman named Mrs. Morton, insisted on interviewing me alone. Sarah Jenkins advised me to answer honestly but carefully. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, my hands trembling in my lap. She asked pointed questions about the night I'd called Mrs. Henderson. Had I taken the children without permission? Technically, yes, though my parents had left us alone and unreachable. Had I refused to return them? Yes, because they'd abandoned us for a business trip. Each truthful answer sounded damning without context. Meanwhile, my parents' lawyers interviewed Mrs. Henderson in the living room. I could hear Brenda's voice rising occasionally, playing the victim perfectly. She'd learned new phrases overnight about parental alienation and emotional manipulation. Liam crept into the kitchen, despite instructions to stay back. He pressed against my side, and Mrs. Morton watched our interaction carefully. When she asked him who took care of him, he pointed at me without hesitation. She wrote something in her notes that made my chest tighten. The twins escaped next, drawn by Liam's absence. They climbed into my lap like they'd done 1,000 times before. Chloe explained to Mrs. Morton that I braided their hair every morning because I was the only one who knew how. Noah added that I cut the crust off their sandwiches just right. Mrs. Morton observed how naturally they oriented to me, how I responded to their needs without thinking. She asked if they ever went to their parents for comfort. The twins looked confused by the question. Chloe finally said they tried once, but Mom said she was busy. By afternoon, all my siblings had found their way to the kitchen. Even Daniel, who should have been napping, toddled in dragging his blanket. He climbed into my arms and fell asleep against my chest, his thumb in his mouth. Mrs. Morton watched me juggle 5 children effortlessly. I helped Liam with a splinter while holding Daniel, mediated a dispute between the twins over a crayon, reminded Sophie about her quiet time, and fixed Noah's twisted sock, all while answering questions. She asked about medical care. I rattled off vaccination schedules, allergies, medications, and the pediatrician's direct number from memory. When she asked my parents the same questions later, they couldn't name a single allergy or medication. The lawyers argued for hours. My parents' team insisted on immediate return, claiming every moment away constituted further psychological damage. Sarah Jenkins countered with documentation of neglect and abandonment. Dr. Vance arrived for an emergency session. She'd been asked to provide immediate assessment given the serious allegations. My parents performed their routine again, but cracks showed. Brenda snapped at Sophie for interrupting. Richard ignored Daniel's outstretched arms, too focused on his phone. During a break, I overheard Brenda whispering furiously to her lawyer. She wanted to know why this was taking so long, why they couldn't just take their property and leave. The lawyer reminded her to call them children, not property. Her mask had slipped enough that even he noticed. Mrs. Morton pulled me aside privately. She acknowledged the unusual situation, but said the allegations were serious. If my parents could prove kidnapping, I could face charges. The room spun at the thought of jail, of leaving my siblings completely unprotected. But then she added something else. She'd seen enough cases to recognize the truth. She advised me to stay calm, keep caring for my siblings normally, and trust the process. Her eyes held an understanding that made me want to cry. Evening approached with no resolution. The lawyers agreed to reconvene tomorrow with a family court judge present. My parents left with threats about criminal charges and lawsuits. Brenda's parting look promised retribution. That night, I barely slept again. Every sound made me think police were coming to arrest me. Daniel woke repeatedly, sensing my distress. I held him close, memorizing his weight in my arms in case it was the last time. Morning brought a circus to Mrs. Henderson's lawn. My parents had called extended family, painting themselves as victims of a teenage rebellion. Aunts and uncles I'd never met stood outside, demanding to see the children they'd never bothered to visit. Mrs. Henderson refused to let them in. They shouted accusations about brainwashing and elder abuse. Someone called the police, claiming a hostage situation. 2 officers arrived, looking weary at the family drama. They interviewed everyone separately. By now, my siblings' story never wavered. I took care of them. I'd always taken care of them. The officers noted the lock on my bedroom door and the photos Miss Sharma had taken. The single bed for 7 children. The evidence of systematic neglect. The family court judge arrived at noon. Judge Evelyn Hayes was an older woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She commandeered Mrs. Henderson's dining room as a makeshift courtroom, though she emphasized this was just a preliminary hearing. My parents presented their case first. Their lawyers painted a picture of concerned parents trying to retrieve children from a disturbed teenager's control. They had character witnesses, friends who'd never questioned why they never saw the children, who believed whatever story they'd been told. But then the evidence mounted against them. Ms. Sharma presented her findings. Dr. Vance explained parentification and role reversal and presented her psychological evaluation report. Mrs. Morton, despite her initial skepticism, testified about observing me manage 5 children with more skill than most adults. The judge asked to speak with each child. My parents' lawyer objected, but she overruled him. One by one, my siblings told their truth. Liam explained about the lock. The twins described sleeping in my room on sleeping bags. Sophie showed her drawings. Noah talked about being hungry when I wasn't there to make food. Daniel was last. At 2, he could barely testify, but his actions spoke volumes. When the judge asked him to go to his mommy, he toddled straight to me. When she clarified she meant his other mommy, he looked confused and pressed closer to me. My parents' lawyer tried damage control. He argued about biological rights, about temporary confusion, about the need for professional intervention to restore proper bonds. But the judge had seen enough. She issued a preliminary ruling. The children would remain with Mrs. Izzy Henderson under emergency custody. My parents would have supervised visitation only, pending full psychological evaluations. Any criminal charges were dismissed as unfounded, given the evidence of abandonment. Brenda exploded. She screamed about her rights, about the injustice, about how we'd all regret this. Richard tried to calm her, but she turned on him too, blaming him for not controlling the situation better. Their perfect unity cracked in front of everyone. The extended family melted away, embarrassed by the scene. The friends who'd come as character witnesses left quietly. In the end, my parents stood alone on Mrs. Henderson's lawn, their performance finally over with no audience left to appreciate it. But they weren't done. Over the following weeks, they tried every angle. They reported Mrs. Henderson for elder abuse. They called CPS with anonymous tips about substance use. They filed complaints with the school board about truancy. Each investigation found the same thing. 5 children thriving in Mrs. Henderson's care. Perfect attendance now that I didn't have to miss school. Grades improving. Daniel speaking more words every day. The twins growing confident enough to play separately sometimes. The supervised visits were disasters. Brenda spent the entire time trying to interrogate the children about what they told the judge. Richard sat in the corner on his phone, occasionally looking up to complain about missing work. The supervisor ended several visits early due to inappropriate behavior. They tried manipulation through gifts. Expensive toys appeared at visits, bribes for affection, but Liam pushed away the remote control car, saying he'd rather have someone read to him. The twins ignored the fancy dolls, asking instead why Mom never braided their hair. Their lawyer advised them to show genuine change. They enrolled in parenting classes, but attended sporadically. They started therapy, but fired 3 therapists who suggested they might be at fault. They couldn't fake accountability because they genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, life at Mrs. Henderson's house settled into new rhythms. I still woke early from habit, but now Mrs. Henderson helped with breakfast. My siblings still came to me for comfort, but they began to trust Mrs. Henderson too. Daniel even napped in her arms sometimes. School became possible again. I joined study groups, made a friend, even attended a school dance. My siblings thrived with consistent care and actual parenting. Liam's anxiety decreased. The twins developed individual personalities. Sophie's drawings showed happy figures now. The final custody hearing arrived 6 months later. My parents entered with new lawyers, their 4th set. They'd crafted a new narrative about temporary mental health struggles, about being overwhelmed, about wanting to repair their family. But the evidence was overwhelming. 6 months of failed supervised visits, multiple professionals testifying about the damage done. My siblings' clear preference documented extensively. Even their new lawyers seemed to know they were fighting a losing battle. I testified last. Judge Hayes asked me directly what I wanted. For the first time in 4 years, I spoke my truth in front of my parents without fear. I explained the exhaustion, the isolation, the constant terror of separation. I described raising 5 children while being a child myself. Brenda tried to interrupt to correct my lies, but the judge silenced her. I continued, explaining how I loved my siblings, but wanted to be their sister, not their mother. How they deserved real parents, not owners who saw them as burdens. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Full custody to Mrs. Henderson. My parents' rights reduced to supervised visits every other week, contingent on completing therapy and parenting classes. The parentification was noted as severe emotional abuse in official records. My parents left without a word to any of us. Their performance had no finale, no dramatic exit. They simply walked out, already discussing an appeal with their lawyers, but everyone knew it was over. They'd lost their audience permanently. That night, we celebrated quietly. Mrs. Henderson made a special dinner. My siblings drew pictures and sang songs. Daniel took his first independent steps across the living room, finally confident enough to let go of my hand. We cheered like he'd won an Olympic medal. Months passed. My parents' visits became less frequent. They'd cancel for work trips or social events. Eventually, they moved 2 states away for a fresh start. Their visits dropped to monthly, then holidays only, then hardly at all. I started therapy to process 4 years of trauma. My siblings attended play therapy to learn healthy attachments. Mrs. Henderson took parenting classes voluntarily, determined to give us everything we'd missed. We weren't perfect, but we were healing. On my 16th birthday, Mrs. Henderson threw me a real party. Friends from school came. We played silly games and ate too much cake. My siblings made me cards with drawings and misspelled words that meant everything. For the first time, I felt like a teenager. The adoption finalization came through on a sunny Tuesday. Mrs. Henderson officially became our legal guardian permanently. My parents hadn't contested it, too busy with their new lives to fight anymore. We stood in the judge's chambers, all 6 of us plus Mrs. Henderson, becoming a legal family. That evening, I tucked my siblings into their own beds in their own rooms. They still sometimes climbed in with me during storms, but by choice now, not necessity. I kissed each forehead, said goodnight, and walked to my own room. My room, with posters on the walls and homework on my desk, with a door that locked from the inside if I wanted privacy, with space for just me because I was 16, and that's what 16-year-olds deserved. Mrs. Henderson appeared in my doorway for our new nightly ritual. She asked if everyone was settled, if I needed anything, if I was okay. Such simple questions, but they meant everything. Someone else was checking, caring, parenting. I pulled out my journal, a gift from my therapist. Inside, I wrote about normal teenage things, school drama, crush updates, weekend plans. The entries were boring and beautiful, exactly what they should be. My siblings were safe, loved, and thriving, and finally, so was I.